Vampyr has all of the hallmarks of a game that should capture my heart. Aside from the obvious bit that it's a role-playing game wherein you play as a vampire, because I firmly believe that we need more of those, looking at you, Paradox, Vampyr is a game that takes the concept of dichotomy and runs with it, while at the same time promising an experience that is reactive to the decisions that you make. It's a game that sells itself on the power of choice, where the question is not, do you kill, but who do you kill, with the effects of those choices echoing on the streets of London and bringing it either closer towards salvation or disaster. So why didn't I love Vampyr? Why didn't this game blow me away? That's probably because despite it having some great ideas on paper, Vampyr doesn't really succeed in translating them into a system of mechanics that feels satisfying to play. Those ideas don't really develop beyond a surface level, and what you get is a game that, while it's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, fails to impress in almost all of its aspects. It's a game that's just fine. It's not bad, but it's also not great. It's just okay. And that is, in and of itself, fine. But for a game that has as much ambition as something that Vampyr has, being just fine reflects more on what it fails to achieve rather than what it does achieve. And those failures stand out so much that they dictate the entire direction of the experience. Vampyr is a game developed by Don't Nod Entertainment, who is probably best known for their 2015 breakout game, Life is Strange. Having not played any of Don't Nod's previous games and only knowing them peripherally, the best I can say is that Vampyr seems to follow the same ground that's been laid out by Life is Strange and Remember Me, in that it's yet another game that has a heavy focus on narration and character choice. However, Vampyr is, at its core, an action RPG. This means that it has all of the traditional trappings that you would expect from a modern game in the genre, including dialogue choices, experience gain, skill trees, equipment options, and crafting. And before I continue with this review, I really want to address the elephant in the room and get this out of the way right now. If you're planning on going into Vampyr with the hopes that it's going to be an updated or a modernized version of Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines, just don't. You're only setting yourself up for disappointment. These are two totally different games with two totally different design philosophies, and quite frankly, I feel that Vampyr, that is Don't Nod's game, doesn't quite pull off the feeling of actually playing as a vampire, or the intricate web of vampire politics nearly as well as Bloodlines does, despite making bold attempts at doing so. I'm purposefully trying to avoid drawing comparisons between the two because Vampyr, Don't Nod's, deserves to rise or fall based on its own merits. But I also know that for your average gamer, it's very hard to look at both and not draw comparisons. And what does make Vampyr stand out is just how much effort has been put into making the inhabitants of its world feel like living, breathing characters. Most of them, at any rate. There's a stark difference with how the average NPC and actual plot-important NPCs are handled, but we'll get into that. But those NPCs that you run into on the street, those citizens of London, those are the real breakout achievement of the game. Each one is handled with such care that in a lot of ways, they're the stars of Vampyr. All of the NPCs that you can interact with as you traverse the game's semi-open world are fully three-dimensional characters, all with their unique stories to tell and their own secrets to unlock. And those stories and secrets are reflected in what Vampyr calls its citizen system, which is itself an interconnected web of social circles and relationships that creates an independent social ecosystem within each of the game's 4 main hub areas. All of these NPCs are characters with backstories in their own rights, and each of them can expand on those stories in 2 ways. The first is the sharing of information. Asking these NPCs personal questions will usually bring you to a screen that states you need to discover more hints about them in order to prod them about certain topics. Things like their actions or affiliations can usually be dug up by talking to them, and that information is passed on through word of mouth. So, say one character has something to say about another character, you can use that information from the first character to prod the second character to divulge more information about that topic to you. This is an important mechanic because the more information you have about a character, the more experience points you get from them when you embrace them. In fact, the quickest way to become powerful in Vampyr is to murder every single one of those characters you encounter, take the XP that you gain from their blood, and then evolve your powers so that you become a juggernaut of total destruction. This is also the fastest way that you can uncover each of those characters' secrets, as you consume their souls and their final thoughts as you feed on their essence. However, the catch is that removing these characters from these hubs, or letting them fester in illness for too long and not curing them, has a detrimental effect to the overall order of those areas. If any of those hubs become critical, you lose access to them as they're overrun by a combination of the Spanish flu and the vampire scourge. This affects what ending you can get at the end of the game. And as many of these characters are also quest givers in their own right, the second way that their backstories can be expanded, you lose access to those quests if you let a district get too out of control. Also, one neat thing is that the citizens actually do respond to disruption to their social circles with dialogue changes. For instance, I had embraced the soul of the lover of a character from the docks, and upon speaking to her again, she directly referenced his death to me. Then when I had decided to embrace her a few hours later, she once again mentioned the name of the other character who I consumed even earlier. This is a really neat thing to see, since those little details actually make the people that you encounter feel all that much more alive. It motivates you to struggle with the decision of killing everyone at the expense of the city's overall health, or to strive to try and preserve them, and do the legwork to discover everything that they have to hide from you manually. It's a mechanical reinforcement of the game's theme of dichotomy, wherein you're a doctor who's trying to save lives, but at the same time you're an undead creature who feeds on the living. However, the citizen system is not without its faults. For starters, the quests that you go on for these NPCs is largely vapid. They consist of no more than mere fetch quests that offer nothing of any real value of completing them, outside of perhaps the joy of learning more about the characters and their stories. While I feel that this is in and of itself reward enough, it certainly doesn't quite justify the effort that goes into doing the busy work in the first place. Secondly, the citizen system has no bearing on the game whatsoever in terms of choice and consequence. None of the characters that you run into and help on their quests or divulge secrets from or even kill alter the course of the game's world in the slightest way, outside of a numbered representation of how much closer a district is to falling under a chaotic overthrow. You don't even get the grace of having those ending screens at the end of the game that tell you how these characters' lives were affected as a result of you meddling in their affairs. And this ultimately leads to an unsatisfying conclusion where you don't get to see the results of your choices as you made them throughout the game. If it wasn't for the fact that one of the game's 4 endings is tied into finishing the main quest without killing a single citizen, the citizen system is ultimately pointless outside of its own narrow scope as an engine to deliver these characters that don't quite fit into the frame of the main quest. It's a shame to see a system that is as interesting as the citizen system get cast aside before it's even fully developed, especially as I fully believe that this had the potential to be just as fascinating as something like the Nemesis system from Shadow of Mordor. It barely scratches the surface, and just when it gets interesting, the rug is pulled out from right under your feet. I wish the developers did more with this, because this is the hallmark of something that could have been truly special, and is quite honestly the best part of the game. And this hurts twice as much as it should, because these citizens are infinitely more interesting than the majority of the characters that you meet during the course of the regular game. Many of the villains you will encounter are immediately dropped into your lap, and introduced just before you're forced to fight and ultimately kill them. There's no time to digest who they are or what their motivations are, or how to approach their personalities, or even decide whether or not they're worth saving or killing. These choices have already been made for you, and it starkly contrasts the meticulous system that's built around all of the peripheral characters that you encounter. It's as if 2 teams that weren't really allowed to communicate with one another had to write the game's script, with one team in charge of the main plot and the other in charge of the citizens. And the only information shared between the 2 of them are which characters bleed over into the main plot before they're discarded. And that's made all the worse by just how weak I found the main story to be, especially towards the game's last act. As a whole, the story is just like the game, it's fine. But what starts off interestingly enough just takes a turn towards the unsatisfying following its major revelations. And I don't just mean the one ending out of the 4 that I was given either. Many of the plot threads that you're following are wrapped up nicely in an endgame explanatory dialogue dump that makes references to some of the major decisions that you made over the course of the game and tells you the results of those choices. But these decisions also don't really have any discernible effect on the ending that I can tell. I mean, I can take a guess at why I got the ending that I did, but I just don't know for sure. The ending cinematic comes and goes so quickly and makes references to the state of the endgame that are so vague that I was half expecting it to transition to some other explanation before I was treated to the credit roll. I have no problem if I get an ending that makes me ask questions about whether or not I did the right thing while playing the game, or if I get a bad ending based on my choices. But only if I can at least see how those resolutions came to be and how my decisions made an impact on them. I think Vampyr lacks this severely, and its rigid and very linear series of mainline quests makes comprehending your choices and their respective consequences far more convoluted than frankly it should be. Certain quest decisions can result in you missing out on the opportunity to get some of those secrets that are buried away in the minds of those characters, but it's about the only deviation that you're going to get. Even when the game gives you those chances to spare, kill, or turn characters into vampires, the consequences for those decisions don't really make any sort of appearance outside of that last minute dialogue that you get before the game's ending. And as good as the citizen system is, it ultimately plays second fiddle to the game's main story. And it's the main story's rigidity and unwillingness to integrate that citizen system into itself that makes that feel flat and lifeless by comparison. None of this is helped very much by a combat system that is passable, but doesn't do anything special or is really intuitive to use. You have a stamina meter that's shared between your quick dodge button and your one and two-handed weapon attacks as well as your melee offhanded attack, which means that stamina management is paramount to not dying. Ranged weapons can most effectively be used as interrupts, and each enemy has up to 4 different resistance types: melee and ranged physical attacks, and blood and shadow vampire attacks. You also have a blood meter that fuels your vampiric powers, which ranges from healing to throwing blood spears at your enemies, to making their blood congeal and temporarily paralyze them, to even having an ultimate ability that does some pretty devastating damage. If there was one part of the combat system that I can say really turned out well, it would probably be your powers, since they have a great amount of weight to them and it feels pretty great to start boiling the blood of your enemies and impaling them with blood spears. Each power branches off and allows you to customize what they can do in combat to a limited extent, and there's a decent number of different things that you can throw at your enemies depending on your playstyle. They're really fun to use, and I think the developers had a lot of fun designing them. You also have a handful of other tactics, like stunning an enemy and then feeding on them mid-combat, which gives you several invincibility frames, but more importantly, also lets you recover a moderate amount of blood so you can keep throwing your supernatural weight around. Honestly, Vampyr's combat reminds me a lot of a system that wasn't too dissimilar from Jade Empire, with an emphasis on dodging and waiting for an opponent to leave you an opening before going to town on them. The biggest downside is that there's a rather limited assortment of powers and weapons that you can get. There isn't a whole lot that fleshes out your arsenal, and once you find a weapon that you like and you've upgraded it a couple times, there really isn't too much reason to switch to another one. Often, combat will devolve into using the same few combinations over and over again, as specialization is really the key to success here, especially during some of those boss fights that you're going to run into. You're going to want to maximize your damage for the amount of blood that you're spending on your powers, and lower level abilities simply will not cut it during later portions of the game. There's nothing inherently bad about the combat system, but it's very simple and it feels uninspired as a whole. And I think that's the game's biggest flaw because, quite frankly, more than anything, it just doesn't feel all that fun to play. The powers are great, but the overall combat feels loose and not very cohesive, and it feels very forced. The same sort of button combinations coupled with a really weak and awkward targeting system on mouse and keyboard just makes combat feel like a chore. It's the same sort of repetitious busy work that the side quests are made up of, but made even worse because of the respawning mobs of enemies and the ever-increasing level scaling that you encounter. To me, it feels like the combat was the biggest afterthought, which is unfair to say because Vampyr was actually delayed in order to further polish the combat systems. But when you're sprinting through hostile cities that are crawling with hunters and savage, mindless vampire spawn because you can't be bothered to fight them and you just want to get on with the story, that's a sign that particular element of gameplay has overstayed its welcome. Simple systems combined with a lack of enemy, weapon, power, and even animation variety makes it feel rote, and you never want an action game to feel like that. Had it not been pushed so far into the forefront of design, I think I would have been a little more forgiving of the tediousness of it all. But because I had to engage in so many combat encounters and just bored myself to tears constantly fighting the same handful of enemies and constantly retrying the same boss fights over and over again, it's left an impression on me that's more negative than positive. I know that I've spent a lot of this review pointing out the flaws of Vampyr, and while there really are a lot of them, it would be disingenuous to say that it's a bad game. I need to emphasize this. It's serviceable. Hell, at some points, it's a title that's even enjoyable. If you look beyond the sum of its parts, there is certainly some fun to be had here. But the trouble is that I think that I was hoping for a lot more, and I was ultimately let down at every turn. The combat was basic, and it doesn't really offer anything too noteworthy beyond a limited arsenal of some really cool vampiric powers. The main story is too narrow in scope when it comes to decision making and reactivity, and while I love the concept of maintaining balance between various city districts and combating various illnesses that pop up, it felt more like an afterthought than anything else. The biggest thing that this game has to offer, its citizen system, is great. I truly enjoyed uncovering as many stories as I could from London's denizens, and the game's implementation of making the player choose between gaining immense power or staying true to their Hippocratic oath on a mechanical level was fantastic. But even then, I wish the citizen system had more weight and carried greater consequences. And that's really the theme of Vampyr. It's got some good ideas on paper, but it lacks in execution. It's not a total disaster, it's not even a partial disaster. It's just a game whose offerings don't quite live up to its promises. The end result is a game that is okay. I mean, I didn't hate it, but I certainly didn't love it as much as I wanted to either. And while that's by and large fine, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that the game's asking price is 66 Canadian dollars. So, at that point, the question is whether or not you think that a game that is just okay is worth that price of admission.